Salutations! Chapter 3 begins with what I hesitate to call a consideration of the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas. I hesitate because Professor Dawkins doesn't engage with the 5 ways as they are, but instead provides us with his own versions that only resemble Aquinas' actual arguments if you squint. He demonstrates this before he even starts by saying, "The first 3 are just different ways of saying the same thing and they can be considered together." Except they're not. They rely on entirely distinct observations and follow different trains of logical inference. The fact that Dawkins can't tell that these arguments are different shows that he either didn't understand any of them, or he only understood one of them. Unfortunately, it appears to be the former case. See how he summarises the first way. Nothing moves without a prior mover. This leads us to a regress, from which the only escape is God. Something had to make the first move, and that's something we call God. This doesn't look like the argument from motion at all. The entire structure is wrong, and no mention is made of the central observation that underpins the entire argument, the act-potency distinction. Keep in mind that when Aquinas says motion, he means any kind of change. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality, but nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Neither Aquinas, nor Aristotle, from whom this argument originates, ever says that nothing moves without a prior mover. What he says is that only actual things can cause potential states to become actual states. Let's use an example. A potential Godzilla could potentially destroy Tokyo. Since Godzilla is not actual, as he doesn't actually exist, he can't actually destroy Tokyo. The destruction of Tokyo by a giant radioactive dinosaur is a potential that can only be actualized by an actual Godzilla, not by a potential one. But an actual Godzilla would require the existence of actual dinosaurs for him to mutate from. Nowadays, dinosaurs only potentially exist, they don't actually exist, so they can't actualize the potential Godzilla. Now you get the picture. A change or motion is a transition from potential to actual. A change can only be caused by an actual thing. This means that there must be something that is purely actual, with no potential, otherwise nothing could ever be actual. Let's see if the learned professor can do any better at grasping the next one. The uncaused cause. Nothing is caused by itself. Every effect has a prior cause, and again we are pushed back into regress. This has to be terminated by a first cause, which we call God. No, that's wrong. Aquinas does not say that every effect has a prior cause. He does, however, say that things don't cause themselves, so Dawkins has understood a good 50% of this argument. What Aquinas actually says is that, since things don't serve as their own efficient cause, every given thing must either have an efficient cause outside of itself, or have no efficient cause. When Aquinas says efficient cause, he is again invoking Aristotle, for whom the efficient cause is the circumstance that brings about an effect. Even things that are infinite or have existed forever have an efficient cause, a set of circumstances that allow for them to exist. So we're not talking about the beginning of an effect in time. It is impossible for everything that exists to have an efficient cause outside of itself, because that would mean either an infinite number of metaphysical layers supporting one another, or things causing their own causes, which is the same as causing themselves. This means that there has to be something that is uncaused in the efficient sense. Again, that does not mean something that has always existed or started on its own, it means something that could not possibly fail to exist or to be different under any circumstances. Let's hear Dawkins illuminate the third way. The cosmological argument. There must have been a time when no physical things existed, but since physical things exist now, there must have been something non-physical to bring them into existence, and that's something we call God. What? Now, I've said already that the professor's previous summaries don't resemble the actual arguments, but this one is on a whole other level. The third way is not about physical things. It doesn't say that there must have been a time when they didn't exist, and it doesn't say that they must have been brought about by a non-physical thing. If Dawkins hadn't stated explicitly that this is his representation of the third way, then I would not have recognised it at all. The third way actually goes like this. For anything that exists, either it is possible for it not to exist, or it is impossible for it not to exist. Either the thing could be destroyed and stop existing, or the thing must exist by its very nature, has always existed and can never stop existing. So we have two sets of things, but we don't know how many things belong to each set. If everything that can exist can also not exist, then it is possible for none of those things to exist. If that is possible, then reality itself could at some point not exist. This obviously has never happened, because if reality didn't exist, then nothing would ever start existing, so we wouldn't be here. A state of reality could lead to a state of non-reality, or another state of reality, whereas a state of non-reality leads to nothing. This means that every state of reality stretching infinitely back from us has only led to another state of reality by pure coincidence. That is an indefinitely long series of perfectly lucky coincidences, which is ridiculous. So it is reasonable to conclude that there is at least one thing that must, by its very nature, always exist, under all circumstances and with zero possibility to ever stop existing, and that this thing allows for reality to continue. Now, this doesn't automatically mean any sort of God, but if one is to say that it is the laws of physics or mathematics or some such abstract idea, one must admit that these things have an independent reality that is not bound up with matter, and therefore abandon materialism. Dawkins then gives us a pathetic rebuttal that doesn't even work against his own cartoonish strawman versions of the arguments. All three of these arguments rely upon the idea of a regress and invoke God to terminate it. They make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress. The entire point of the arguments is that an infinite regression is impossible. The Terminator God of these arguments is not immune to infinite regression, it is an alternative, indeed the only plausible alternative, to the very concept of infinite regression. To put it simply, Professor Dawkins cannot even effectively argue against religious arguments he has invented himself. He follows all this up with a non sequitur. There is absolutely no reason to endow that Terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God, which is not the subject of these arguments and therefore has no bearing on their validity. In fact, these arguments do tell us something about the nature of the Terminator they refer to. The first way tells us that the Terminator is pure act, having no potential for change in itself, and is perpetually doing everything it possibly can do, and also that it has an infinite capacity to impart actuality. The second way tells us that the Terminator exists in every possible set of circumstances, and therefore is present everywhere. The third way tells us that, by its very nature, the Terminator sustains existence as such, preventing the possibility of non-reality. Now we move on to the fourth way. This way is actually not a good argument to use in modern times. The reason for this is that it presupposes idealism, which does not feature in the worldviews of modern atheists, but did feature in the worldviews of the heathens that Thomas Aquinas was interested in converting. Naturally, Dawkins doesn't even recognise it as an argument, because as he has demonstrated, he has never read a book on the subject he's writing about. So let's look at the fifth way. Just as with the others, Dawkins refrains from presenting the actual fifth way in favour of inventing his own, and just like the third way, his own version is so different from the actual argument that I can only imagine he didn't read it at all. The teleological argument, or argument from design. Things in the world, especially living things, look as though they have been designed. Nothing that we know looks designed unless it is designed. Therefore, there must have been a designer, and we call him God. This argument has nothing to do with living things. In fact, it applies to everything except living things, which are specifically excluded. This argument also has nothing to do with how natural objects look or how they are shaped, except incidentally as they are reshaped by motion, and it has nothing to do with being designed. This argument is actually about the regularity of natural processes. Natural processes, including movement, chemical reactions and so on, happen in regular, consistent and predictable ways, rather than in random ways. When you shoot an arrow from a bow, it goes in a straight line until it hits something or is pulled down by gravity. This happens every time you shoot an arrow. Never, or perhaps only very rarely, has an arrow shot from a bow corkscrewed into the air turned purple and sung show tunes in the voice of Danny DeVito. This regularity is not accountable by matter alone. One might say that the laws of physics are abstractions from the way matter behaves, but if that is the case, there is nothing about the laws of physics that suggests that matter should behave that way 5 seconds from now, only that it has behaved that way up until this moment. Without the imposition of a pattern, a set of forms, all one could reasonably be expected to observe in a universe is a sort of primordial chaos. Our observation that the universe stubbornly continues to behave regularly confounds materialism. For Aquinas, this pattern is a design within the mind of the Catholic God. For a Platonist, this pattern is the progression of the logoi, which are derivative of the forms in the intellectual sphere. I will leave a link in the description to an article going over all the stupid misrepresentations of cosmological arguments like the 5 ways that commentators commonly make. Professor Dawkins moves on to the argument of Saint Anselm, which he actually manages to communicate recognisably. This argument essentially states that real things are more perfect than imaginary things, and therefore if it is possible to imagine a perfect thing, it must exist in reality or it won't be perfect. I will happily join the learned professor in denouncing this argument as terrible. It can easily be said that it is impossible for a human mind to grasp the full magnitude of a perfect being, and therefore it's impossible for us to properly imagine one. Christians and Muslims themselves claim that their God is ineffable and beyond the understanding of mortals. Next, Professor Dawkins tackles what he calls the argument from beauty. This isn't even a formal argument, and no major philosopher has ever put it forward. As Dawkins represents it, it essentially runs as, God is real because I like things. Since he doesn't seem capable of grasping even the basic premises of the 5 ways, I think this sort of thing is more up the professor's alley. Now we come to the argument from experience. This is not an argument in favour of God specifically, because it doesn't speculate about the essence of the things being experienced. In fact, it is a much more effective argument in favour of daimonia. The professor naturally says offhand that if anyone experiences anything outside of his own ideas about reality, it must either be a hallucination or a case of mistaken identity. If one man sees a pink elephant, it can be dismissed as a loose screw. But if millions of people see pink elephants, and all of them give remarkably consistent descriptions of them, then any reasonable person must conclude that even if there aren't literally pale purplish pachyderms, there must be some sort of external entity that is presenting itself to people in a way that makes them think of bigness, pinkness, and trunks. Ultimately, the only objective difference between hallucinations and ordinary sense perception is that in the latter case, other people usually agree with you, or at least, your sense perception tells you that they agree with you. This is why Platonists regard aistetos, or sense perception, as inferior to dianoia, or discursive logical thought, which is itself inferior to noesis, or direct contact with intelligibles. The common materialist quip goes, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and certainly if we are looking for empirical evidence for a claim, this is a good rule of thumb. However, claims about manifestations or phasmata are not extraordinary in the least. They are more banal than a great many claims that materialists accept. They are found everywhere, in every part of the world, in every time period, under innumerable circumstances, and with zero regard for local culture, class, or religion, and most importantly, they are incredibly consistent. As paranormal researcher Charles Fort says in his book Wild Talents, the wonderful, or the never before heard of, I leave to whimsical or radical fellows. All books written by me are of quite ordinary occurrences. It is not because these claims are extraordinary that materialists reject them, it is because they imply something that materialists axiomatically presuppose to be false, so alternative explanations for every single individual case are preferred over a simpler explanation that accounts for the commonalities. Can you imagine what it would look like if you did this for any other phenomenon? We can presuppose that locomotives don't exist. That man who said he rode a train here? He must have ridden a taxi and misidentified it as a train. That woman who works in a train station? She's lying for attention. Those train spotters? There was dust on their binoculars that obscured their vision. That video of a train? It's fake. All of these different explanations are better than the idea that they all saw trains, because the latter would imply the real existence of trains, and that would require extraordinary evidence. Unfortunately, I believe we are going to have to stop here for today. So, thanks for watching and have a nice day.